Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you for the invitation to address you this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be associated with this new program and to have the opportunity to say some words in introducing it. And thank you very much, Luis, also for your kind words about everything we've achieved in the past, in particular during my time at UNESCO. What I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon is the question of the past and the future from an Orwellian perspective, the perspective of George Orwell. I'm assuming knowledge of George Orwell, rightly or wrongly, his style, his purpose, and in particular knowledge of perhaps his most famous work, the novel 1984. Assuming knowledge of that particular novel is probably quite reasonable in a context such as this. I'd be very surprised if anyone were to tell me, if we were sitting in the room together, sorry, no, never heard of it. Whether everyone is familiar with George Orwell more generally is a bit of an open question. And certainly if you look at the way Orwell is represented on social media these days, almost entirely through the medium of 1984, you sometimes have the impression that people have read the book or read selected quotes from the book, but actually have no idea who the author was. That's not very important for this particular presentation, though I will come back to it briefly later. 1984, as you know, I won't give an extensive plot summary, is the story of a totalitarian regime and one individual's attempt to revolt against it, an attempt that ends with failure. The totalitarian regime is called Oceania. It is, the novel suggests, basically the English-speaking world, North America and the United Kingdom. The novel is set in London, indeed, but it's very clear that the rest of Europe is part of a different geopolitical entity called Eurasia, about which the novel says nothing except that it exists. And in this thoroughly dystopian society, set imaginatively in 1984, the novel, as you probably know, was written in 1948 and published in early 1949. Oceania is governed by a ruling party called simply the party, by an ideology called INGSOC, short for English Socialism, and by a mythical leader. No one's sure whether he as leader actually exists as a person or whether he's merely the symbol of the party and its ideology, called Big Brother. And the revolt against this totalitarian system is the revolt of an individual called Winston Smith, who is driven to oppose the system and ultimately be destroyed by it by two things. And the two things are very interesting. One, I will discuss in a lot of detail, the other not, but it's good to keep both things in mind. The two things that lead him to revolt are love and the past. He ends up failing, and indeed, between love and the past, he is forced to choose love of Big Brother. The final words of the novel being precisely, he loved Big Brother, at which point the story is over. But basically the whole thrust of the novel, both as a novel, in terms of the action or the plot, and as a philosophical exercise in reflecting on the nature of political power, is essentially connected to Winston's relation to the past. Hence the fact that talking about past and future in terms of 1984 is, I think, a very relevant and very instructive exercise. It's important to note in terms of Orwell's purpose, which is often not fully recognized when the novel is quoted, that he was above all a satirist. He was a great admirer of Jonathan Swift, for instance. And the purpose of satire in Swift, as in Orwell, is not to predict the future, but to exaggerate certain trends and certain features of the present, 1948 in this case, in order to reveal their inner logic. Not to say what will happen, but to say what the present means if we try to understand it deeply, and if to exercise our imagination, to get beyond some of the superficial features of the world in which we live, we push its characteristic features as far as they can possibly go. And as many commentators on the novel have noted, basically everything Orwell describes in his Oceania, every aspect of the party that he invents, is effectively a combination of Stalinist Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, pushed to their logical conclusion and turned into something much more systematic than either of those regimes actually was in reality. The novel has produced many memorable phrases, often turned into memes on social media, sometimes memes created by people who clearly have no idea what they're quoting from. Among those memorable phrases, there is one I'd like to focus on, which, as many of you will have guessed, is the point of my title. This is the following quote, which is one of the slogans of the party. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Controlling the past, controlling the future is both how the party exercises its hegemony and the reason for exercising hegemony in the first place. And Winston quotes this slogan in the course of his own musings about memory, history, the past, and what it is to be human. And Orwell, through the words of Winston, reflects to a considerable extent on the way in which memory, history, and the past connect to what it is to be human. And Winston is particularly sensitive to this, those familiar with the novel will recall, because his job in the official newspaper of the regime, which Orwell provocatively calls The Times, just as in the London of his own day, is to rewrite the past every day in order to ensure that it fits the needs of the present. Any prediction or statement made in the past by the party must be eternally true, which means that if the party got it wrong last year or 10 years ago, that past has to be rewritten in order to ensure that the party has always been right. And that task of rewriting, including rewriting yesterday's newspapers to fit in with today's idea of what is correct, is what Winston spends his day doing. He and many others, of course. Now, on its face, this party slogan looks like something like a template for a constructivist utopian project. Controlling the past is a means to controlling the future, and controlling the future is the whole point of the political project. And this is true at one level of analysis, but at the same time, like much else in the novel, like many of the party's slogans, it's also deeply misleading and self-contradictory. The most famous of the slogans, engraved in enormous letters on the column on the front of the party headquarters, slavery is freedom, or freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and so on, are deliberately self-contradictory slogans adopted as such in the name of an ideology that the party promotes of so-called doublethink. And as we will see, and this is interesting, very interesting in terms of the kinds of issues that a program such as this needs to explore, the slogan, he who controls the past controls the future, he who controls the present controls the past, is itself an exercise in doublethink, deliberately misleading and self-contradictory, inviting the loyal party member to think two incompatible things at the same time. And therefore, by rejecting any idea of objective truth or even simple semantic coherence, to create the space for absolute political domination. As Hannah Arendt, whom Orwell didn't know because her Origins of Totalitarianism was published contemporaneously with 1984, but whose thought intersects in very many ways with the thought of George Orwell, emphasized, the point of totalitarianism is not to tell lies and to be expected to be believed and to expect to be believed. It is to erase the very idea of truth, which means that because nothing is true, nothing is a lie either. In the same way, and this is something Orwell says explicitly in the novel, in the same way that in Oceania, nothing is illegal because there aren't any laws. There's a close parallel, obviously, between these 2 points. And Winston comes to realize the misleading and self-contradictory nature of the party's slogan through his own engagement with the past. Again, fans of the novel, or those who simply remember it well, will know that his personal engagement with the past, his ideological revolt against the party, comes from the chance circumstance that led him at one point to have in his hands a copy of a photograph, which by some miracle had not been altered by the party, that showed the party's discourse to be a lie, something that proved that the past had been altered because it was a residue of the past prior to its alteration. And this existential moment in his life leads him to be deeply interested in the past in ways that can only lead him on a collision course with the party of which he is a very minor and very junior member. This engagement with the past takes 2 forms, both of which, as we will see, are very interesting for the broader subject that I'd like to discuss here. First, memory. But this turns out to be deeply frustrating and ultimately fruitless. Winston's attempts to recover his own memories turn out to be of little value. His memories are incomplete and unreliable. He has no direct personal access through memory to a time before the rule of the party, including because he was a child at the time. He tries, therefore, to rescue memories to which he doesn't have personal access by engaging with a member of the proletarian class, the proles, the non-members of the party, the majority of the population, over which the party exercises absolute domination. But his attempts to engage in a pub with an old man who has, or should, or be expected to have personal memories of life before the party turn out to be radically unsatisfactory too. Memory has been erased, not literally in the sense that people have become amnesiacs, but in the sense that there is no social basis for the maintenance of memory, and therefore memory becomes simply random collections of anecdotes. Secondly, partly as a response to this disappointment of the engagement through memory, Winston engages in the past, or with the past, through artifacts, and in particular 2 artifacts that become symbolic and metonymic of his relationship to the past and his attempt to undo the ideological domination of the party. On the one hand, a notebook, which he happens to find in a secondhand shop, a notebook with real paper, for which he manages to acquire a real fountain pen and ink. Not entirely clear how, but doesn't matter. These are the MacGuffins, as Alfred Hitchcock famously said, that make the story possible, and a paperweight that he discovers in an antique shop. A paperweight which he finds beautiful, but in addition to its beauty, he finds it important because it has survived unaltered from a past that has not been rewritten to give it contemporary meaning, but simply exists as part of the present. Of course, the paperweight is hidden in his drawer, as is the notebook, but survives in the present as an item, a trace of an objective past. And as Winston puts it on several occasions, if the past survives in objective form, it is through artifacts that have retained their integrity, artifacts that haven't been modified, rewritten, erased, or effaced to fit the needs of the present. And yet these objects inherently are divorced from meaning because they are detached from memory. There's no way of knowing what the paperweight means, where it came from, who made it, how it was transmitted. It simply is. And in that respect, artifacts and memory should be working together, but in the social conditions of Oceania in 1984, they can't. They are mere tokens of a past that is essentially out of reach. From the limitations inherent in these forms of ultimately futile engagement comes Winston's realization that in the party's world, past and future are not controlled, not really, despite the slogan. They are erased, precisely because they cannot be controlled. For the past to exist means recognizing the existence of artifacts that can circulate without alteration, possibly also without meaning, but at least without alteration. Recognizing the past as past, in other words, is recognizing its unalterability, its objective nature in Orwell's terminology, which we might find epistemologically naive these days from a social science or humanities perspective, but was still very central to the way in which he himself wrote. Not, of course, even in Orwell's thinking, because the past is fully known or immune to interpretation. On the contrary, it's the limits of knowledge and the provisional, contestable nature of interpretation that mark the past as something more than what we think or say it to be. And conversely, it is the party's claim to say what the past is, and indeed to create it for its own purposes, that denies the existence of the past as past, that erases it, which echoes, you may have noted, with a very famous quote from William Faulkner, who said in one of his novels that the past is not dead, it's not even past. Writing about a part of the United States in his fictional Mississippi that was dominated by a past that was unable ever quite to pass. Erasure of the past is the only way of ensuring that the past remains safely past, safely dead as past, and therefore denying it as past. And similarly, symmetrically, recognizing the future as future is recognizing its radical non-existence. The fact that it exceeds control beyond the trivial short-term instrumental predictions that are embedded in direct manipulation. I can plan this lecture in a certain way. I can shape my immediate future over a couple of hours and perhaps shape yours too, condemned to listen to me. Just like when we throw a ball or flip a switch or book a ticket, we are to some extent shaping certain limited aspects of the future. But these acts of micro-control don't control the future. They merely make some small aspects of it present, and they cannot, by their very nature, be extrapolated, scaled up, or generalized. And we might add a good thing too. All of this leads Winston in the novel to a very striking observation which deserves to be quoted in full. He says, writes as follows, talking about the world in which he lives, Oceania in 1984. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. An endless present, not control of the past or of the future, but erasure of the past and the future in favor of the creation of an endless present. This is the contradiction, the doublethink in the party's slogan. For the past to be controlled, it must cease to exist. Maybe less obvious for the future, but I'll come to that in a second. You will note, incidentally, that the word statue in the first sentence that I just quoted points to one of the reasons why Orwell is currently a very popular reference for the reactionary right of the political spectrum on social media in particular. People who regard constructive reinterpretation of statues in whatever form that might take as being something that violates the sanctity of the past and is supposedly introducing some Orwellian project of social control. The fact that Orwell himself, as I'm sure all of you know, was a lifelong democratic socialist is one of the interesting ironies in the way he has become a posthumous standard bearer for a certain kind of reactionary right. Put that aside as a parenthesis. So, that the party erases the past rather than controlling it is clear enough. It may seem less obvious, as I said, that the future is also being erased. After all, many aspects of the party's plan for society in the novel are explicitly constructed. There is a plan to generalize and systematize the use of newspeak, the form of language characteristic of Oceania that is designed to limit, restrict, and ultimately prohibit thought. The abolition of the orgasm, as perhaps jokingly put by O'Brien, the inner party character who entraps and tortures Winston Smith in the novel, as a horizon for the transformation of humanity that is necessary for the permanence, the indefinite permanence of the party's rule. Yet, Winston observes, while still in his rebel mode, the decline of technological progress in Oceania. The future is being technologically closed by indifference to science and technology, embedded in the logic of pure political control. And when he's given access to the mysterious forbidden book, which describes the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, as the book is called, given by O'Brien for the purposes, among other things, of entrapment, he understands, or at least sees a rather sophisticated analysis of the fact that the whole purpose of this oligarchical collectivism, as it's called, is to stop the pendulum of political change, to end history, not just in the sense popularized by Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s, history as capital H grand narrative of ideological conflict, but more profoundly, history in the sense of anything whatsoever happening. Beyond the full realization of INGSOC, English socialism, lies nothing. Nothing. It is a utopia that is entirely devoid of content. The party is creating a world in which nothing henceforth will ever happen. And O'Brien, as the voice of the inner party, the voice of the intellectual dimension of oligarchical collectivism, recognizes in his discussions with Winston Smith, in between torturing him physically and mentally, the endless present extends also into the future, not just with respect to the past. And O'Brien gives Winston a dramatic statement of this future as endless present, another phrase that's very often quoted from the novel. If you want a picture of the future, O'Brien says to Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Now, there are two angles to this. One is obviously, why would the picture of the future be a picture of sadistic persecution? But almost more interesting is the way in which the sentence ends, forever. Only one thing happens, which is another way of saying that nothing happens. Now, this is satire, of course. Orwell is underlining the absurdities of utopian thinking by this dystopian trope of the ultimately undesirable future. A utopia is essentially a kind of eschatological fantasy, one in which all ends having been achieved, there is nothing left to do. One in which humanity has effectively abolished itself by realizing itself. The pendulum stops, as does any kind of dialectic. But the satire, pushing things to the logical and at the same time absurd conclusion also shows the lie or the doublethink at the heart of the party slogan. The future isn't controlled any more than the past is. It is abolished, at least as project, as idea. And there's an interesting paradox here. This is that an eternal present in which nothing happens, a system in a state of maximum entropy, is the ultimate form of sustainability, in the literal meaning of the word sustainability. And yet, at the same time, it is clearly a nightmare, and it's sustainability in the service of nothing, achieving nothing, producing nothing, allowing nothing to emerge. This is ultimately the characteristic of a state of maximum entropy, thermodynamic equilibrium in an isolated system. Once it's reached that point, nothing further can change. Which means, and this is the point that I would certainly want to emphasize, that freeing sustainability from stasis is perhaps the basic Orwellian thought about sustainability. And indeed, this chimes with Orwell's thoughts about environmentalism and environmental issues, which are admittedly a bit scattered. They were not the leading issues of his time. He wasn't personally specifically committed to them. And he was extremely hostile to the environmentalists of his day as a political force. But nonetheless, his thoughts on these issues are fundamentally anti-industrial on both moral and aesthetic grounds, grounds that he shared with many conservatives of his day and of earlier days back to the middle of the 19th century. Orwell observed fundamental transformations which he felt to be negative because they destroyed what was valuable in the past, irreplaceable things of beauty, and the emphasis on beauty is important in Orwell's work. The famous paperweight, which I mentioned earlier, is valued, among other things, because it is beautiful. And by destroying those valuable things from the past, undermining their own material and symbolic conditions of reproduction, reducing human life to the boot stamping on the human face, as if everything else had to be eliminated in order to make that perfectly sustainable non-future, that endless present of persecution, viable and sustainable. There are many examples scattered through Orwell's writings. In 1984 itself, the emphasis on the ugliness of the physical environment and the tastelessness of food, but also the famous scene in the novel Coming Up for Air, published in 1939, where the protagonist visits a place of idealized natural beauty from his childhood and discovers it destroyed and disfigured by the construction of a housing estate, or the way in which the bodily sacrifice of the miners in The Road to Wigan Pier is framed in the discussion, even though The Road to Wigan Pier is not a novel, as a kind of almost blood sacrifice to the dark gods of industrialism, encoding in the bodies of the miners the symbolic structural violence of the system itself. At the same time, he was, as the whole novel shows, acutely sensitive to the fundamental inhumanity of a world without change. So if change is perceived to be mostly bad as a fact, not by the nature of change, but by the nature of the circumstances in which it took place during the Industrial Revolution and extending into the interwar period and the Second World War, including by transforming the conditions of war, of human inhumanity towards other humans by the power of technology, the answer is not to stop things changing, but to think differently about the possibilities of change. And I think we can argue though he didn't say so very explicitly in his own writings, that for Orwell, the objective reality of the past and the imaginative openness of the future were intimately and organically connected. And possibly I'm interpreting his writings in that way simply because I happen to agree with that myself. So let's say that it's an Orwellian view, which I'm expressing based on Orwell, rather than necessarily Orwell's view of things that he wasn't necessarily aware of, he came too early, and which he was perhaps a bit too conservative, despite being a democratic socialist. For him, there was no contradiction to endorse. But his writings, I think, still open the right doors that can be very useful to us in thinking about these issues today. To put it very simply, sustainability is sustainability of a future still unwritten, anchored in a living past. There are two paradoxes there. The idea that we can think about the future even though it doesn't have a script, and the idea that we can relate to a past that is supposedly unalterable and objective in something like Orwell's sense, while still recognizing that our relation to the past is a living relation of appropriation, imagination, and reinterpretation. And that's what I'd like to discuss in the closing section of this talk. In particular, what does this approach mean for the kinds of themes that are relevant to this program? Themes of landscape and territory, identity, artifacts, memories, new infrastructures and planning processes, innovative practices, beauty, performance, representation. Rather random list of words, others could be added, but something like the concatenation of those ideas and that vocabulary maps the space within which people doing doctoral work, and in particular doctoral research in this program, will be engaged. The key points I'd like to emphasize in this regard are imagination, co-construction, and emergence as they connect to the relation between past and future. To recognize that the past exists objectively is to emphasize the existence of raw material, shall we say. Things that, like the paperweight in 1984, just happen to be there, regardless of exactly where they come from, because knowing that requires work, and regardless of exactly what we do with them. They have an existence which is their own, whether we're talking about buildings, used buildings or ruined buildings, landscapes, however natural they may seem to be, and however unaware we might be until we do the work of the historical process of construction from which they have emerged. Texts, stories, images, again, which circulate sometimes without context, but which we can both relate to as they stand and study and enrich through knowledge of where they come from and interpretation of what they might mean. The raw material is there. It offers the basis on which we can do productive, creative work on this raw material. Indeed, as Orwell emphasizes, particularly in reference to the famous paperweight, which again is an object, but also a metaphor and a metonym for the past, there is a need, a yearning, perhaps a duty to preserve this raw material, to enhance and enrich it, and thereby to make it available for study and reinterpretation. The constant work on the past, both what we were already aware of through our existing legacies and what we discover anew, whether as archaeologists digging in the soil, as archival researchers finding new texts and images in some repository, or as social researchers asking questions and getting people to speak and capturing aspects of the society in which we live, thereby producing more material for ourselves and our future selves study, we are effectively making the past a living past. Now, this may sound a bit like erasing the past as objective, inalterable reality. In fact, it's the opposite. It is the living past as past recaptured, reinterpreted, transformed, enriched, and made part of life that keeps it alive as past. On one condition, that its past lives are available to be reinterpreted. The erasure in the party's domination. Thank you, Luis. I noted that I need to wind up. That's absolutely fine. The erasure in the party's domination is not simply the erasure of the past, but of the discourses of the past about the past. That's what creates this eternal, endless present. Similarly, whereas the only way to control the future is to erase it, and the only way to try to control it is to colonize it, the only way to sustain it is to open it as a living future, just like the living past, which takes place in the present. Just as the past exists by being appropriated in the present, recognizing its objective reality. Similarly, the future exists in the present by being appropriated, recognizing its complete absence of objective reality, precisely because the future hasn't happened yet. In other words, the present is the only place where humans can act, imagine, create, build, whatever else, but it's not the only place in which we live. In acting in the present, we live in the continuum, the imaginative continuum of present, past, and future as lived present experience, from which the future emerges, not unconnected to our plans and desires, but never determined or controlled by them, whether individually or collectively. And sustainability is, to this extent, I think, best seen as sustainability of this lived past and this lived future, which are closely connected to one another because each is the possibility of the other. In other words, as inscription in the present of the uncontrolled timeline through which life achieves continuity and meaning. By contradistinction with the world of 1984, where the fantasy of controlling the timeline, thereby erasing the present, erasing the past and the future, as lived experience, deprives life of continuity and meaning. This may all seem a bit abstract and artistic, but I think it has a very practical thrust. If one thinks of the ways in which infrastructures in particular relate to the spaces they occupy, both physical and imaginary spaces, building codes and water management systems, forests, commercial exploitation, energy production, transport, all of these use the raw material of the past, including the distant geological past of the planet, and by using it, transform it, make it present, and leave it to the future in altered state, thus shaping future conditions of habitability, flourishing, and ongoing emergence. There is a temptation to want to erase the traces of the past in order to open up the future. And there is a temptation, perhaps to the point of extinction, as is currently fashionable in some environmental philosophy, to leave no trace in order to keep the future open. But in that case, not for us, since we have been extinguished. I think the opposite is true. It is by recognizing traces and valuing them that we can create the possibility of genuine sustainability. With that, time is up. I will close. There could be a lot more to say on the subject, but I hope you found these thoughts at least interesting, and perhaps they've stimulated you not just to reread 1984, but to go look at some of Orwell's other writings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for this very, very interesting approach. And I'm sure there would be many colleagues interested in raising questions, including myself. But what we will do